Christmas Eve 2019 from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. So rethinking Canada through Indigenous ice hockey. This is the theme for this video. Indigenous meaning the native Canadians, so who used to be called Indians, Eskimos, and Métis, but now are called, for example, First Nations, or then referred to by their tribe names like Cree and Ojibwe, or Ojibwa, or Chippewa. The Cree hockey player Eugene Archon, these words, "We won one in their barn," made little sense. In the 11 years he had skated for 2 Saskatchewan Indian residential schools, no settler teams had ever visited the dilapidated outdoor rinks at St. Michael's Residential School in Duck Lake or the Capel School in Le Bray. The article was written by Associate Professor of English Language and Literature Sam McKegney of Queen's University, Ontario, and Michael Oxy, Indigenous Research Officer, University of Toronto. And the article was published on the conversation.com website, a Canadian current affairs blog, on May the 23rd, 2019. It wasn't until he was 23 when Archon became the only Indigenous player in the region's intermediate AAA or AAA hockey league that he learned from settler teammates that home ice is supposed to be an advantage. We, Mike Oxy, Anishinaabe, Estonian, and Sam McKegney, white settler of Irish-German descent. Yeah, and then if Mr. Oxy's last name is Estonian, it should be pronounced Auxi. Estonians are related closer to us Finns. Are researchers with the Indigenous Hockey Research Network, IHRN. And they interviewed Archon in Kingston, Ontario as part of their network's preliminary work to cultivate critical understandings of ice hockey's role in relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. Archon, whose Cree Nehiyawewin name is Aski Kananumo Wata, and whose treaty number is 380, knows what it's like to be denied the right to play in a home barn in his traditional territory of Treaty 6. He was a member of the Indian Residential Schools IRC Truth and Reconciliation Survivor Committee and has been honored for his work in support of Indigenous sport in Saskatchewan and across Canada. Regimentation, discipline, and control were at the core of residential school design as a means of conditioning Indigenous children to shed their cultural values. So, for example, their native languages, their native religions and cultural habits. Much like Filipinos were told, especially by the Spaniards, to do, starting in the late 16th century. Physical education was well suited to this enterprise, say Indigenous Studies scholar Braden Tahiwi of the University of British Columbia and sport historian and sociologist Janice Forsyth of Western University, also an IHRN researcher. Exactly how sport curricula was used varied over time and territory, as well as along gender lines during the over 100 years of residential schooling in Canada. Where they were present, sports like ice hockey were built into the institution's social engineering regime, as what University of Ottawa health researcher Michael Kobidu calls a disciplining device. Yet the experiences of Indigenous players were not confined by institutional objectives or the goals of individual overseers. Forsyth and historian Evan Habakirk, also of Western University, argue that sports helped many students make it through residential school by being a forum in which they could develop a sense of identity, accomplishment, and pride, even in the context of trauma and abuse. As Cree residential school survivor Philip Michel explained in a talk he gave at Opaskwayak Cree Nation, we were told we were no good in residential school, but in hockey we were good. We were just as good as anybody. In many cases, we were better. Khan recalled his teammates showcasing their skill against settler teams at tournaments. However, their experiences differ dramatically from those of the non-Indigenous children. We'd put all our equipment on at the school and get on the bus, and we'd go to whatever town. And we'd play sometimes 3 games in one day. After each game, we'd get back on the bus. We didn't ever get to socialize against our opponents. Years later, Khan asked a former supervisor from the residential school, "Why would you make us wear our equipment all day like that? Other children got to undress. Other children got to run around the rink, and we didn't. We had to wear our same stinky equipment all day long." The supervisor replied, "So you wouldn't run away." So once again, an ethno-racial stereotype. Indigenous children supposedly were more likely to run away. Well, given the often brutal and insensitive ways in which they were treated, no wonder. In 1887, the first Canadian Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, who was a conservative and was also serving as the Minister of Indian Affairs, identified the great aim of the Indian Act legislation as being to assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion, meaning the Canadian Confederation. Contradictions, however, persisted at the heart of this legislation. Well, for example, the native people could not vote unless they renounced their native people status before 1960, which of course was deeply racist. When residential schools were at their peak, policies like the pass system on the prairies, well, smacks of the pass system used in South Africa during the apartheid regime from 1948 until I think about 1990, when the most famous Black South African civil rights and political activist, and later the country's first Black president, Nelson Mandela, was released. Policies like the pass system on the prairies actively prevented Indigenous people from integrating into settler society. While residential schooling was ostensibly about absorption, contemporary policies enacted barriers to inclusion by restricting mobility. Assimilation in Canada has never meant equality. Another factor complicating Indigenous experiences of ice hockey is the way the sport is romanticized in this country, of course, as a part of the Canadian identity, because Canada has often defeated its much more populous and militarily much stronger southern neighbor, the United States, whether in the World Ice Hockey Tournaments, championships meaning, or in the Olympic Winter Games ice hockey tournaments. The IHRN's early research suggests that ice hockey is linked to the naturalization of settler entitlement. Ice hockey belongs to Canadians because it belongs in the Canadian landscape, so the story goes. Thus, participation in the game allows settlers to imagine they belong here too, with adverse implications for Indigenous people. Khan remembers the ferocious nature of anti-Indigenous racism in Saskatchewan ice hockey in the 1970s. So much so, he shares that when his team's trainers packed up the sticks after a road game, they'd leave his out for safety. I had to use my stick to defend myself in those arenas. Sadly, almost 50 years after Canada officially adopted multiculturalism in 1971, during the first term of the late Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, Anti-Indigenous racism persists in Canadian ice hockey today. In the past year, the First Nation Elites Bantam Triple A team faced taunts of savages from spectators, players, and coaches at the Coupe Challenge or Coupe Challenge tournament in Quebec. 5 First Nations teams from Manitoba found themselves without a league to play in when the non-Indigenous teams against which they used to play formed a new league from which they were excluded. Yet teams, coaches, players, and fans are not without the artillery to make positive change. The final report of the TRC provides guidance via calls to action 87 to 90 on sport and reconciliation. The report demands government-sponsored athlete development, culturally relevant programming for coaches, trainers, and officials, as well as anti-racism awareness training. Between 1975 and 1981, long before Colin Kaepernick's and other football players celebrated acts of protest, Khan refused to stand for the Canadian national anthem. Years later, when the horrors of residential school were coming to light through the TRC, one of Khan's settler teammates from those days embraced him at the International Ice Hockey Federation World Under 20-year-olds hockey tournament in Saskatchewan. He told Khan, "Now we understand." Khan, a target of brutal assimilation policies and racist violence, says, "Sports saved my life. Hockey saved my life." Provided Canadians reckon with hockey's relationship to settler colonialism and racism, Khan insists we still need the game.